Welcome to Family Life Perspectives. This is Dr. Harry Broomfield, Director at Perspectives Counseling Centers, and your host this week on Family Life Perspectives. Truly, we'd just like to take a second and say thank you for joining us. I've been away from the air for a number of weeks, and so glad that you've joined us, and I'm glad to be here this morning. We have a special guest in studio all this week, Dr. William Guy, PhD, MD, staff psychiatrist back at Perspectives Counseling Centers, and going to be talking about something he feels very fervently and strongly about, not only as a physician and a psychiatrist, but as a Christian parent who is very interested in raising children in the nurturement and admonition of the Lord. Dr. Guy, so glad that you're here, and what is on your heart this week, and that truly has you fired up as a Christian man, but also as a scientist and as a professional and as a physician. What has you fired up this week?
Well, there was an article published a couple weeks ago in the journal called Pediatrics. Now, actually, it was published online July 2nd, but it's for the August issue of the journal called Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it was published by an investigator by the name of Dr. Afifi, and Tracy Afifi. And what she basically is saying in this study is that harsh physical discipline causes increased risk of mental illness, substance abuse, and personality disorders.
Oh, man. Now,
the problem is that in the study, or what she did was she looked at surveys done. And this is published on the university. This work was done by staff of the University of Manitoba in Canada, but it's based on data that was collected between 2004 and 2005 on United States residents. About 34,000 people, well, 34,653 people were interviewed. And what they did was they compared various groups according to the discipline they received, and then they took a look at the outcomes. Everybody who was interviewed was 20 and up, and it's a retrospective epidemiological study.
Yes.
Where they took a look at how they were disciplined, whether they were physically disciplined or not, how they were disciplined, and then what were the outcomes. There were essentially four groups, if you will. You had the group that was never touched. They had no physical discipline whatsoever. Not a hand was laid on them. And then you had the group that were abused to where blood came out, extensive bruising, there was physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. So she looked at that abused group, and then they had people who were traditionally spanked, and then you had people who were hit, shoved, pushed, slapped. Now the thing is, in the past, there have been studies on spanking, and they've tried to say that spanking is bad for you as an adult. You grow up messed up because you got spanked. And the average person, 80% of us spank, by the way. I mean, 80% of the American population, when they have kids, they spank their children at some point. Well, most spanking Americans, when they hear about a study that says spanking causes problems, they automatically, and using common sense, think, well, you have some people in that group that were abused somehow. Okay, and so that throws it off, because people who abuse usually also spank. They use corporal punishment, so they get thrown in there, and so we realize that these studies are flawed.
It's skewed right from the outset.
Yeah, exactly. But the Afifi group decided, they said, you know what, let's exclude the group that was abused. And that was wise, of course. That's good, and I'm glad they did that. But in this particular study, what they did was they compared 19,349 people who claimed never to have been hit in any way to 1,258 people that had been hit, slapped, and shoved. And they excluded the group that was spanked.
Excluded?
They excluded them. Anybody that got the paddle, that got an open hand, that got a switch, anybody that was spanked was excluded from the study. 14,046 people were excluded from the study.
But you would think that would be the study group.
Yes, yes. Well, they excluded them. And later on, now what's interesting, and I think what's a little bit deceptive, is I've looked all over this article, and now I found out that they were excluded because of interviews based on the study. Later on, news interviews with with Dr. Afifi. But if you look at the study, she doesn't come right out and say that they excluded them. Okay, now she does explain the group that was used, and so she does explain that you're comparing the group that was hit, slapped, and shoved, but they don't come out and say we excluded the groups that was spanked. And the reason she gave for excluding them was it's difficult to define spanking. Some people define it as a belt or a switch or open hand. We couldn't define it exactly, so we just excluded them and looked at harsh physical punishment as defined by, whacking, slapping, shoving, and pushing. And therein lies the problem. Okay, that data is there. The data on those 14,000 people, many of which were just spanked, that data is there, but wasn't reported. And I strongly suspect, I really do, at the core of my being, I strongly suspect that if the spanking group had shown more mental illness or more substance abuse that was substantial, that would have been in this study. But they were excluded. And she only looked at the paltry 1,258 people compared to almost 20,000 people that were never spanked at all. And even with that, even with this group who wasn't spanked but instead slapped, shoved, and pushed, even that group, you're only looking at a 5 to 7% increase in in Axis 1 mental illness, or by Axis 1 we're talking about depression, major depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and so forth. But you're looking at a 5 to 7% increase in those disorders, and a little bit increase in personality disorders and substance abuse disorders. I'm surprised it wasn't higher, because the group that they're looking at was not spanked, but they were physically hit or pushed or shoved, probably, and I would suspect mostly because the parents were irritated and they just hauled off and gave them a little whack.
Right. But arguably, this is physical abuse.
Yeah, I would say it is. I would not call this discipline. I wouldn't call this discipline.
Neither would I.
Even though it didn't draw blood or leave serious marks, that's not discipline. A parent who just reactively whacks a child but does not spank, that's not discipline. No. And certainly, as a Christian, I would not consider that training, helping to train your child when you just get upset and whack. And I can see why that if you grew up in a family where you had parents that just whack when they're irritated, of course you are going to learn that it is appropriate when you're frustrated with somebody to haul off and smack them. I can see where that would lead to more abuse. But to exclude the spanking group really destroys this study. Now, the other thing that destroys the study is, here's the other problem I have with this, is that if you take a look at the overwhelming majority of news articles that came out after this was published. You know what?
I'm going to interject there.
Sure.
Need to get a word from our sponsor when we come back. What is the media saying about this?
Okay.
All right? We'll take a pause right now and get a word from our sponsor. Welcome back to Family Life Perspectives. Dr. William Guy and Dr. Broomfield talking about a study in a recent Pediatrics journal discussing the concept and value of spanking or corporal discipline. But it's a flawed study, and you were going to talk about how the media has taken this and ran with it now.
Yeah, again, you're looking at a study that excluded thousands of people who were actually spanked, and they only included the people that were whacked, shoved, pushed, or slapped in some way.
Yes.
All right, and we see this slight increase in Axis 1 mental disorders as well as personality disorders and substance abuse. And so the title of the article is appropriate. Physical punishment and mental disorders results from a nationally representative U.S. sample. That's the title of the actual study. And they defined harsh discipline, like I just said, as pushing, shoving, smacking, slapping, and so forth. Now, even though they excluded everybody that was actually spanked, here are some of the headlines, and I'm just going to read a few. Hitting your kids increases their risk of mental illness. Now, that was published in Family Matters. That was probably one of the more accurate descriptors. I can see that. Okay, fine. Now, here are some of the others. Spanking kids leads to adult mental illness. That's from MedPage Today. These go out to doctors.
These are professional.
Exactly. These are professional newspapers.
Yes.
That go to physicians. In my own, I subscribe to Medscape, and that was a headline news article that basically comes right out and says spanking leads to mental illness. Here's another one. More science to support what parents already know. Spanking children can have long-term negative effects on health and well-being. Here's another one. Spanking points to Study points to the downside of spanking children. And another one, spanking linked to mental illness. It goes on. There are, if you Google this study, you will find hundreds, I don't know if it's hundreds, but boatloads of headlines that say spanking leads to mental illness based on this study. So you see the problem here. Number one, big time problem, this is an epidemiological study. It does not prove causation. It does not prove that even this, it does not prove that the slapping, smacking, and whacking caused the mental illness itself. I mean, I'm not saying that that's healthy at all. I'm not supporting that at all.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
But it's like, okay, I'll give you something similar. We do know that in the United States, approximately 25% of the population have some type of mental illness. Okay, arguably, but that's about in the general population.
Yes.
All right. Now, if you look at the jail population, people actually in prison feel better than people in jail. Okay, and local jails are the most depressing incarcerations.
Yes.
And if you take a look at that population, 60% have some type of mental illness. Now, you could say, aha, well, since the general population is 25%, but over 60% of people in the local jail, you could say, therefore, incarceration in local jails causes mental illness. See the problem with that?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone is like, yes, there's something wrong from the core here.
It doesn't. You haven't proved that the jail caused it.
No causation.
Now, certainly, I suspect jail's a little depressing. I would be a little bit depressed if I was in jail. All right, seriously, because probably you're not going to make the mortgage, and you might lose a few things. So I can see how that could be troublesome.
For sure.
Okay, but. Are you depressed because you're in jail, just that? Or is it that people who go to jail tend to do things a little differently than the folks that don't go to jail?
Dr. Guy, we need to pause right there. And you know what? Those listening, I think, are already on board with you. Can you be back with us tomorrow?
Sure can.
You know what? I think every listener that has been tuned in today also will be. So until tomorrow,